Minister, Lord Mayor, colleagues from the City of Cork, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a delight to be here. I think it's some 10 years since I was last here. And as I mentioned, it was at the invitation of the university, and your former president was here, Mary Robinson, as well. So that was a delightful experience, and today's is no less delightful. As was indicated by Dennis, I'm from the University of Glasgow. I wear many hats, and the particular hat that I'm going to wear today is that of director of the Pascal Observatory. And the day will be absolutely full of acronyms, and oh, that's the wrong button to press. I think I should be doing another one. That's just making, okay, I've got it, okay, thank you. A sign of age. Should have put my glasses on first. It's a day of acronyms, and I'm director of Pascal, and just like it was maybe a little bit difficult to unpack what EcoWell stands for, it's equally difficult probably to unpack what the acronym Pascal is for. It stands for Place and Social Capital and Learning. And Pascal is an organisation which emerged from the work of the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, in 2002. Immediately after an OECD project from 1999 to 2002 around learning regions. That project was in Europe, but somehow there was a dissemination event in Melbourne of that work. And after the dissemination event, people said, wouldn't it be a very good idea if we could keep this going in some way? And someone came up with the clever idea of an observatory, which captured good practice in relation to the way in which learning occurs at city level, network, social capital, the management of place, and thereby Pascal. And Pascal was originally sponsored by the state of Victoria in Australia, and then expanded from a node at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology to Europe, first to the university I used to work at in Stirling, and then onward to Glasgow when I moved there. And since then, we've created bases in the US at Northern Illinois University and in South Africa, at the University of South Africa, the largest distance education university in Africa, and shortly we're setting up another node in Mexico at Tech Monterrey. Only one gap left, and that's in Asia somewhere, and that will happen in due course. If you want to learn more about Pascal, there is the website. You'll get my presentation later, and you'll see lots of relevant activity. Another acronym, and we create acronyms inside acronyms. So we're not satisfied just with Pascal. We then embed Pascal inside other things like Pi and Puma and PU and Pure. The one that's relevant today is Pascal International Exchanges, the Pi. And part of that Pi is EcoWell, which Peter Cairns, my colleague from Australia, who is the director of that initiative within Pascal, introduced earlier this year I should say, when he came to Cork. And we're absolutely delighted that Cork has taken on EcoWell. And today essentially is the first, we hope, in a series of events internationally which will develop the EcoWell concept and build networks around cities that support those principles. Very rapidly, and Dennis will tell me if I'm taking too long, I will just review, mainly in European terms, the rise and fall and then rise again of learning regions and cities. And that phrase comes from a paper that I wrote with another colleague who's here today, Lynette Jordan and Norman Longworth, which has mapped out how this concept of the learning city, learning region has developed. I'll also say something about new developments from outside Europe, particularly in Asia, and link that to initiatives of UNESCO, and in particular UNESCO's Institute of Lifelong Learning in Hamburg. And then at the end, I'll say a few things about what I think the way forward is for new learning regions and cities. More pictures of Glasgow and Scotland. Very, very briefly, just in relation to how this learning city, learning region notion has developed. We could trace it back centuries, no doubt. Indeed, we could trace it back to Greek times and notions of learning being embedded through cities. And indeed, one of my colleagues at the moment at Glasgow is looking at Gaza as a learning city in the 7th century, which is very neat because we happen to be working with the Palestinians at the moment, developing a lifelong learning system for that country. And we're bringing those things together. But more recently, I suppose we can trace back in European terms, probably 4 decades within which lifelong learning has been seen as a priority for policymakers. And we've seen a paradigm shift in that time from talking about education and training to talking about lifelong learning. With some other terms used in between, like lifelong education, but it's lifelong learning that is the term that's used most frequently. And of course, there's a huge body of work on that. And then within that, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen in a number of policy documents the notions of lifelong learning being delivered in the smallest geographical unit possible, at the city and regional level, and you see that embedded in a range of European Commission policy papers as well as papers that are produced by individual governments. This little slide will be familiar to some of my colleagues sitting in the audience, but this is very much a simplification of what we would describe as the purpose and the continuum within which learning cities lie. So at one end of the continuum, the literature from regional innovation, clusters and so on, talks about creating an underlying infrastructure of learning that would make the city or the region attractive to external investors. If you're a big company, if you're a small company, and you're thinking of moving to Cork, one of the things you might look at, whether there's that underlying infrastructure and cohesion in education and training across the formal, non-formal and informal sectors. At the other end of the continuum, you might talk about the learning city as something which Denise has mentioned, as something which creates a set of learning networks that has a principal objective of providing opportunities for those who don't normally get opportunity. In other words, the social cohesion, social inclusion agenda. Of course, this is a completely false dichotomy because in reality, very few initiatives do not have both an economic and social purpose in reality. And very few people's motivation for engaging in learning doesn't have an economic as well as a social purpose. A very brief history then of the terms that have been used. It was the OECD again who introduced in the 1970s the notion of the educating city. A very substantial project then took place around the world that included 7 cities: Adelaide, Edmonton, Edinburgh, Gothenburg, Kakagawa, Pittsburgh and Vienna. In the 1980s and 1990s, across a range of agencies, a number of initiatives emerged which emphasized both the social and economic role of various actors. And by 1992, again, the OECD, a major conference was held in Gothenburg, which led to the creation of the International Association of Educating Cities. I've mentioned already the OECD Learning Regions project from 1999 to 2002, which was in Europe and involved Jena in Germany, Vienne in France, the Orison region, which crosses Denmark and Sweden, Andalusia in Spain, and the Kent Thames side in the United Kingdom. And as I said, out of that came this funny acronym, Pascal, which I will say a little bit more about later and what we're doing in the future. If we look in terms of the rise through the decades, the European Commission took on lifelong learning very seriously and learning cities and regions quite seriously from the late 1990s onwards. Several projects have been funded. One of the early ones was towards a European Learning Society, and in the last decade, a whole range of other projects that have been funded concerned with learning cities and regions, within which we have had a range of involvements. As you can see, again, from an acronym, inside another acronym, I think, PEN R3L, for instance, the Pascal European Network of Lifelong Learning Regions. We've been involved in projects which have developed quality frameworks for learning regions. We've created a major depository of initiatives that have occurred in learning cities and regions around the world. A very recent project called Mason has done a fantastic job in mapping the way in which different cities and regions across Europe have made progress in terms of the way in which they're delivering lifelong learning at a local level, right down to the so-called NUTS 3 level. And if you know that terminology, you'll know that a lot of the people involved are probably nuts as well. If I go on, a range of policy papers have come out of the European Commission. The most significant of which was a policy paper in 2001 about the local and regional dimension of lifelong learning, which led to this R3L programme, Regions of Lifelong Learning, which involves 17 different projects across Europe to develop networks that promote the local and regional within lifelong learning. And of course, there are the higher level papers which have been produced by the European Commission, many of which you will be familiar with. The very famous 2000 Lisbon European Council, which set the strategic goal for the last decade for the EU to become the most competitive and dynamic, knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion, and so on. This gave a lot of impetus towards the development of learning through the life course and learning regions. At the same time, the very famous Memorandum on Lifelong Learning, which many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, which put emphasis on learning to be tailored to the specific requirements of each region. And a little later, another paper, Making a European Area of Lifelong Learning a Reality, which talks about support through its programs for the establishment of networks between those regions and cities with well-developed lifelong learning practices to facilitate the exchange of experience and good practice. You may say a lot of this is rhetoric, but some of these things are things which we've tried to put into practice through Pascal, putting an emphasis on helping cities, working with cities, learning from cities, and helping cities exchange with other cities around the world. There have been a range of nation-state initiatives. In the 1990s, the UK Learning Cities Network. In the first decade of this century, the German Learning Regions Network, with only over 70 regions within the country being designated as being learning regions. And more recently, an Italian Learning Cities Network, and so on. And of course, initiatives that have occurred at the level of cities. And if you look at PI, Pascal International Exchanges, you'll see 20 or more case studies from around the world about how particular cities are doing. And I'm only highlighting here a couple. Kaunas in Lithuania, which I think is quite an exemplar of policy at city level. And of course, your own city of Cork, which I think has got the potential to be a European leader in this area, given all the developments of the last few years. So if we were to summarize some of the notions that underpin the Learning City activity, these are they. Placing the broad concept of learning at the heart of strategies. The notion that we should be looking across a broad portfolio of services that stem from learning. It's not just looking at the formal sector, at schools, colleges, universities. They probably only constitute a fraction of all the learning that occurs. So it's learning that occurs in a whole range of settings, museums, galleries, parks, and so on. The argument being that economic levers alone are not going to be enough for us to develop in the ways that we might wish to in the future, and that lifelong learning is more effective than simply economic levers. And from as far back as that OEC declaration in Gothenburg for educating city, people talk about partnerships and collaboration between and within cities, and drawing up local service agreements, something that we talked about in our R3L Plus project about quality in learning cities and regions between the different stakeholders who are responsible for learning in a city is very important if one is to develop the learning city. A little bit on the negative side, one could say that there's a bit of a fall in Europe. These networks in the UK and in Germany, you don't see much about them. The term learning city and learning region, to a certain extent, has disappeared. Part of that is because the learning city concept has been mainstreamed, and you see it as part of a broader strategic policy in cities and regions within these countries. But equally well, many initiatives are funded with substantial startup money, often from governments, and they don't tend to plan for sustainability. And often these initiatives are not sufficiently strongly embedded, in my opinion, to other mainstream priorities about the economy, progress and competitiveness. Also, of course, there are many competing initiatives, many labels that are used: intelligent cities, sustainable cities, educating cities, etc., etc. And we find very similar conceptual frameworks within many of those initiatives. So I was talking last night with Michael Parkinson, who will be speaking later, and I'm sure he will say that, as I would say, that we could have health as a subset of a learning city, we could have learning as a subset of a health city, and I think others would say the same thing. So we do tend to have a range of competing labels that we could use. That makes it even more important to have some links across ranges of portfolios and to make sure that we're using labels that are comprehensible to everyone. The rise again, very recently, is happening in Asia, in particularly in China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. A lot of that is linked to the work of UNESCO and the promotion of the notion of the learning city by UNESCO. And what they have created is called an international platform for learning cities, which contains a set of metrics which are a potential kite mark standard for cities around the world. Just to give you two examples, in China, there will probably be 500 mayors that will be turning up at the launch of the international platform next month in Beijing. And centralized government will be saying to those mayors, you will be a learning city. Maybe not the best way to go, but they have taken on that notion. In Korea, cities compete to be the Learning City of the Year. They have learning festivals, and accolades are given to cities. It's taken very seriously. And you see in other writers that the idea of learning cities in the 21st century is going to link to a whole range of different ideas, some of which Denise introduced. Goncalves talks about 2 key pillars of equity and sustainability. And of course, if you look at the Rio Plus 20 Summit of 2012, we can get an inspiration where they talk about the social, economic and environmental triumvirate, which of course is maps onto the eco-well concept. So there is some convergence going on between learning cities, or sometimes we talk about learning communities, healthy cities, green cities, eco-cities, culture cities, etc. And that is, we've mentioned Peter Cairns, and Peter has been our leader in this area, and he's brought a lot of these ideas together in PI, Pascal International Exchanges, and EcoWell, which Denise explained in a much more comprehensive fashion than I could possibly do. Thank you for that. Where's she gone? She's gone somewhere else. She's down there. I wondered what the acronym stood for, and we created it. But Peter has been talking about cities around the world being confronted by a seeming convergence of forces that underpin key learning, health, environment, and cultural objectives. And we've got an opportunity to seize this. And if there's a conjuncture of forces that can be developed in a coordinated and comprehensive way through partnerships and a shared vision, so that we can help cities become more sustainable, more humane, and foster learning and well-being for everyone. And that's everybody's responsibility here in the room. Back to UNESCO. That's what the preliminary framework that will underpin the International Platform for Learning Cities. And if you know UNESCO, they always create diagrams that look like this. They've always got foundations, pillars, and a roof, essentially. And if you look at that diagram, you'll see that it's really split into 3 levels. The roof is the wider benefits of building a learning city. The pillars are the major building blocks, and almost most importantly, because the house is going to fall down, the fundamental conditions for building a learning city to stop that happening. And the wider benefits they talk of as being the why. Why do it? Well, they talk about good social, economic, and environmental reasons for undertaking it. And they talk about what you need in terms of the pillars, the data, the educational, analytical, and practical data that you need. Very importantly, at the foundations, the fundamental conditions, the how you do it, relate to the political will, the administrative infrastructure, and the commitment of resources. The next steps for that development, I'm part of the expert group for the development of learning cities, will be refining a set of key features that have been created, a set of metrics. So 40 metrics have been created. We started with 300, 400, 500, and you know what happens when a number of people are in a room. Everybody's got their ideas, and we see indicators this thick. And we've worked on it, and we've worked it down to 40 key features of learning cities that could become a usable tool for cities to measure their progress to becoming a learning city. And when we're in Beijing next month with the 500 Chinese mayors and a variety of mayors from other parts of the world, and an invitation has gone out to Cork, and I'm sure that UNESCO would be absolutely delighted if Cork would like to attend. We'll be looking at those indicators and trying to refine them to create something which is acceptable and that has been customized in such a way that it can be used in a variety of contexts and cultures around the world. Very important if we think about the future, is not just measuring things just for the sake of measuring them, but putting a focus on the key underlying motivations of individuals to participate in learning. And somehow, through the data that we can collect, find ways in which we can motivate people, ways in which we can change people's behaviours to invest in learning. Some of that is linked to things that I was talking about yesterday about collecting much better data, the so-called big data revolution. But it's more than just the data. We've got to customize it in such a way that it's meaningful within small communities, and that it can do things to help change people. Those building blocks that I talked about before are utterly essential. But most important from my perspective are those essential elements that form the foundation, the political will and commitment and good systems of governance. In Pascal itself, we, independently of whatever UNESCO is doing, are developing in a range of ways. Very soon we have our own conference called Cities Learning Together. We have an annual conference, and this time, for the first time, it's in Asia, in Hong Kong. And you would, of course, and I think some people from here are coming, be delighted to join us with a number of other cities and academics from around the world. More immediately, or more locally, I should say, well, more immediately, I can announce today a new initiative from Pascal, which is going to be called Learning Cities 2020, which you can learn much more about if you come over to the University of Glasgow on the 5th of December. We have a brochure hot off the press and ready to be distributed for those people who are interested. In summary, we are interested in going back a decade or so and looking at some of the early learning region work and see how things have developed. But more importantly, we want to do some contemporary analysis of how well cities are doing as learning cities, and link that to the results of PIAC, another acronym many of you will be familiar with, the Programme for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which is announced by UNESCO next week. And so that's going to say quite a lot about how well we're doing as countries in relation to developing learning and competencies in the adult workforce. It's not going to say very much about how individual cities are doing, because the data doesn't drill down to that level. And we're interested in what PIAC says and how that can apply to the development of learning cities. I hope I've kept to time. It's been a delight to be here. I wish you every success. As I said before, Cork is a magnificent example to the rest of the world in the way it's taken on the notion of the learning city and eco-well, and I wish you every success for the day and for the next few years. Thank you very much.